I want to just perhaps introduce the topic a little bit further by quoting a couple of people, just to sort of set the scene, if I may, before I hand over to our speaker. Last month, before the Zondo Commission, as we know, President Cyril Ramaphosa defended the policy of CADRE deployment when he was there speaking as president of the country. Earlier in the year, when he appeared before the Zondo Commission as president of the ANC, he also defended the practice. And he said, CADRE deployment cannot be faulted in principle. It is a common feature in democratic practice around the world, but we would concede that there are weaknesses in its practical implementation that make the case for greater clarity, both within political parties and the state. So, defending the policy, but admitting that there are problems. The ANC chairperson, Gumede Mantashe, took a similar line again before the Zondo Commission. He said, in identifying suitable candidates for positions in public entities, the ANC does not seek to circumvent the established legal processes for the appointment of individuals to these positions. Candidates are still expected to submit their applications, meet the necessary requirements, and be subjected to the normal processes of recruitment, selection, and appointment. However, even with these requirements, there have been several instances where individuals appointed to positions may not have been fit for purpose, may not have had the necessary experience or qualifications. There's two of the leading figures within the governing party defending the policy, but admitting that there are problems. And then we heard from the ANC veteran Mavuso Msimang at a panel discussion just last month, where, again, you get this two sides. He starts off by saying CADRE deployment had a good intention, but it got off to a really bad start. The intention was to build a strong, capable state and get the best people placed in a particular manner so that it did not encroach on the public service system. But I think that CADRE deployment has been a disaster. I'm not aware of how it has demonstrably benefited the state. So a tougher line, you might say, but still coming from within the governing party. And then we can go back almost 10 years to July 2012, a report conducted by the Human Science Research Council, in which one of their researchers at a seminar said the following: one conclusion that seems to be common is that the ANC's deployment strategy systematically places loyalty ahead of merit and even of competence, and is therefore a serious obstacle to efficient public service. So that's just by way of background. Interesting that that last quote is from 2012. This policy has been around, of course, since 1994, but it's become more and more of a hot topic and more and more of a debate. With that, I'd like to hand over to Professor William Gumede. Prof, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very grateful. And I'm actually going to ask you, and I know you started off with a prayer, but maybe just a minute quiet again, another minute quiet of silence. You know, to think about those who passed away during the COVID crisis. So I'm going to, you know, be 30 seconds in a minute, be silent. Thank you for that. Thank you for that indulgence. I'll start off maybe just to thank you for those who are participating, who are attending, for your time. I think what I'll do, I said to Mike, what I'll do, I will send afterwards a paper, it's not too long, a policy brief for circulation afterwards. And I'm open even after, you know, the talk for any clarifications, any comebacks, any responses outside this forum. I'm going to start off just, with the argument that I want to make, that the ANC's policy of deployment, whereby cadres are appointed to key positions in the public sector, local governments, state-owned entities, and also where cadres get preferential treatment to get state contracts. And even, in some cases where they connected Black economic empowerment groups who are seen to be cadres, gets preferential private sector deals as part of Black economic empowerment. Now, my argument is all of that have led to state capture that we've seen. It has led to the collapse of the public services. It's also led to the breakdown of the economy. So that's my main argument, and I'm going to unpack it. Now, the ANC has employment committee at all spheres. So there's a national deployment committee that we always hear about at a national level, but it also has deployment committee at a provincial sphere. There's a deployment committee at a municipal sphere. And these deployment committees sit down and they decide, for example, at the national level, we decide who gets appointed from director levels upwards to director general. So senior position in a public service is normally director. That's sort of your lowest senior position that you can get, but all the way up to director generals. That national committee also appoints executive members of state-owned entities. So they appoint CEOs, board members, chairs of many state-owned entities. And then, of course, we've got, when you come down to the municipal level, where we have city level, municipal level deployment committees, what they do. They appoint city managers, they decide who would be executive mayors, and so on. I mean, that really is the extent. And back to that National Deployment Committee, what it also does, it also makes recommendations in terms of who should get a government tender, particularly the sort of big tenders. But even more alarming, even the private sector, some of the big mining deals, also other deals, of course, where under the deployment committee, there have been instances where the deployment committee actually suggested who should be part of a BE deal, or even, which economic BE partner private companies should choose, eliminating, of course, other players. Now, from a personal point of view, I have been involved in, a couple of government reviews, so government commission reviews. So, I was part of the 2009, if you would remember, 2009 was a presidential inquiry committee into state-owned enterprises, into the reform of state-owned enterprises. I was the principal advisor, the chief advisor of their committee. At the time, I gave an assessment as part of my recommendations about the impact, the negative impact of deployment on state-owned enterprises. If you think about it, maybe we've got over 850 state-owned enterprises. And most of those state-owned enterprises, 80% upwards, are failing. They are drained on the system, they are drained on the fiscus. From a stats point of view, for the last 20 years, the government has spent upwards to 2 trillion in bailing out state-owned entities. Now, a very big part of that, bailing out, the reason why state-owned companies are failing, I would argue, is because of CADRE deployment. Because the thing is about CADRE deployment, often, the big criteria is loyalty to the ANC, support of the ANC, and often not just basic loyalty, but uncritical loyalty to the ANC. I mean, I'm currently part of the, Cyril Ramaphosa a couple of months ago established what is called a high-level ministerial team on the professionalization of the public service. This follows after the big battle between government and the trade unions over public service, public wage increases. So our mandate, and I was appointed to it, mandate is to look at how do we professionalize the public service. And the idea would be when we're done, and pretty soon, we're almost there, there would be a bill to will be introduced into Parliament very early next year to professionalize the public service. Now, a very, very big part, really, again, deployments. One of the reasons why the public service is what it is now. For me, it has to do also with deployment, the appointment from Director General, directors level all the way up to Director General level of often people without the skill set. And also then the recycling of the same people. So, if somebody has done wrong, if somebody is incompetent, if somebody is corrupt, but because the deployment committee has recommended that person can be recycled from one department to the other and recycle failure, recycle corruption, and recycle incompetence. Now, the deployment committee really is, of the ANC, is unconstitutional. I mean, it's, of course, it fits into the ANC structures, but within a broader South African constitutional system, it is unconstitutional and it's illegal. It is illegal because we have constitutional structures that makes appointments. There's a public service commission. From a public service point of view, we supposedly have board of state-owned entities are supposed to appoint CEOs and other board members of state-owned companies. But if the situation where we have, as I say, unconstitutional structure as a deployment committee, it really is a parallel structure to our constitutional structures. Now, from a state capacity point of view, the deployment committee, I think, plays a very big role in undermining state capacity by recycling the same people who are incompetent or maybe dishonest. It has played a role in undermining the capacity of the states itself. I mean, I'm going to get now just to the specifics and maybe start off looking at deployment as a public sector, in the public sector itself. I mean, both President Cyril Ramaphosa at the Zondo Commission and also the ANC's chairperson, Gumede, when he appeared before the Zondo Commission, made it clear that deployment is a policy of the ANC, and is a policy that they support fully, and it's a policy that they're not going to get let go of because they feel that is one way to determine or to direct the policies of the ANC, to direct the ANC's objective and the ANC's goals. So, but I think there's an argument to be made that the costs of deployment to the South African economy, to South African society, and also to the capacity of the state means that we have to reconsider, or the ANC has to reconsider the policy of deployment. And I know, ANC leaders argue, well, other countries deploy and direct where people do go. Now, I have made, again, a study and to look at it again for government, what other countries do. And I think there's a very, very big difference. So there's a couple of societies, of course, particularly the Chinese, they have a policy of deployment. Now, what they do, the difference there is they absolutely make certain, when it comes to deployment, the deployment is merit-based, and you are deployed if you have the capabilities and the skills, even if you are not a member of the party. So the idea really there is so to have deployment. So and the deployment is focused on not loyalty to the party, to the Chinese Communist Party, but on trying to find the best person. And you don't need necessarily to be part of the Communist Party if you have to set the competencies that they're looking for. For example, I mean, Chinese from abroad who've never lived in China have often been deployed to China to run critical entities where they deem there are no skills. So from the Chinese point of view, they often, when they make these sort of deployments, is often when they don't have the skill set in the country, that they would look outside even and so on. So it's a big difference versus the ANC's deployment of let's look for the loyal cadre. All you need to do is to be loyal to the party, and you will be deployed. And of course, the Chinese also has parallel to that, their own deployment policy. What they do is they're very hard on corruption. They do take people on if they corrupt. Now we've got, the ANC's got a deployment committee, of course, where they're very soft on corruption. So if you have proven to be a loyal cadre, you can get away with corruption and you'll never be disciplined. So it's a very big difference. There are other kinds of more softer deployment policies. I mean, South Korea, for example, has a deployment committee, but it's a very, very soft deployment committee, and it's a very circumscribed, it's a very, they only do it really, let's just say, on the boards of state-owned companies, where sometimes there's positions ring-fence, and it will be minority positions on a board where they possibly want to reward a loyal cadre. So, I mean, that policy doesn't exist anymore, but that policy existed in the 1960s, late 1960s, in the late 1970s, during their period of high growth, where often, as I say, I mean, where people were deployed, not necessarily because of competence, but really as a reward for services to the governing party. But often in the way they've done it is say they've ring-fenced it. So let's just say if there's a state-owned board and the board has 8 people, so they would have 1 person or 2 people, and they would then be appointed in that scenario. Again, that's totally different. Now, the ANC's deployment committee, of course, is no different to many other African liberation movements deployment committees. Now, here is, for me, is the issue. Is a big part of the reason why most, I mean 90% of African liberation movements and independent movements have failed in government since the end of the Second World War. We had very, very few successes. If you think about it, I mean, how many liberation movements have there been? In how many countries we're thinking here, about 30 odd. And maybe 2 or 3 of them actually have been effective. And all of them have, and for me, one of the big reasons why they have been ineffective in government and why they have, most of them have in government caused failed states is deployment. The idea that you only appoint your cadres to run very complex entities, and that you don't look at merits, that you look at loyalty first, and as you look at the fact that people were with you in the struggle, and then what the is that many of these African countries then are run by very small groups of people compared to the wider society. So you have really a small group of people that gets recycled and recycled until, of course, you know, they're too old to be recycled. And then often what then happens is a collapse of not only the party, but often the collapse of the countries. I mean, that is, for example, in Zambia. Zambia was a case like that with Kenneth Kaunda, similar deployment strategy. And by the late 1980s, of course, they ran out of people to deploy and so on. And the state has collapsed and the party lost the elections and so on. So that would be a typical what happens in almost, as I say, all of these African liberation movements and the independent movements that came to power. What has happened? So in the African case, the ANC's copied, letter and verse, almost all of the policies of other African liberation movements all failed, and failed spectacularly and totally. So I thought I just, I had to say that for those people who argue that, well, it is fine to have a deployment policy because other countries have deployment committees, because the countries in Africa that had these deployment committees and those who are sort of in the ANC's family of liberation movements and independent movements, all of those countries either ended up as failed states or they ended up poorer than they were 30, 40 years since the end of independence and end of liberation. So that is what deployment has done, deployment policies across Africa. And even in, as I said, the other countries outside Africa that had deployment strategies, the Chinese Communist Party, one of them, had really so careful in the way they constructed these policies that merit-based was a big thing for them. And secondly, is that they used deployment essentially rather more to get non-party members into senior positions if they had in the state, if they had the competency. So it's a little bit different to the ANC's focus. Back to the public sector, back home to the public sector. So of course, in a sense, I mean, we've seen that most of the public sector really cannot do the basic things. State capacity failed across the state. I mean, part of our state actually, of our public sector is actually a failed state. Now, we've got pockets of excellence, of course, but most of our public sector really has failed. So parts of our public sector, we can actually call them a failed state. Now, the only thing that have saved our public sectors so far from a total collapse has been the fact that, different to many other African countries, South Africa has a very strong private sector, a very strong non-state sector. So as the public sector failed, I mean, has been failing because of deployment of cadres, many people who have the income and have the means, they use the public sector, whether it's health, private education, private security. And these days, sadly, but I mean, people have no other choice, is whole estates, private estates are now being created that has schools, security, kindergartens, shops and restaurants, all confined because the state has failed. So if we didn't have our kind of diversified private sector and non-state sector, our states would have long collapsed fully. So we would have had a full state collapse like in Zimbabwe or in Zambia or in Argentina, like it was in Argentina, or Venezuela or in Lebanon. The only difference with us really is our saving grace that we have a private sector that has been delivering public services when the state failed. I mean, I talked about state-owned entities really in terms, what it's meant for deployment. I mean, just a practical example. There's so many practical examples, but think about it. South African Airways, if you look at over the years, I mean, it's a deployment of people, a deployment of Ms. Mieni, who was the chairperson of the South African Airways, and of course, South African Airways have collapsed totally. Thousands of people lost their jobs. People who have contracts with SAA lost their contracts, of course. It had to be bailed out how many times? So that money is that we're using for that was used for to bail out SAA could have been used, of course, for other kinds of services, for education, for health, for housing. There's of course Eskom's a state-owned entity. I mean, has 400 billion plus debt because of CADRE deployment. The costs of Eskom to the economy, factories that have closed, businesses that have closed, people that have left the country, investment that have left the country. I mean, these are the costs and the consequences of deployment. And I'm going to take you to deployment in the private sector because extraordinarily, many private companies are under pressure to take on, deploy cadres in the context of, as part of BE deals, particularly companies who need the state or have very big state contracts, or who need a license, mining companies, for example, because they need a license, mining license. These companies are often under pressure to, in their BE deals, to have cadres as part of those BE deals. I'll just give you a case in point. I mean, former Goldfields chairwoman, Dr. Rampela, when she was the chairwoman of Goldfields, I mean, she said that she, at the time of their Black Economic Empowerment deal, she was forced to accept ANC nominated, deployment committee nominated empowerment partners for its South Deep Mine BE deal. So Goldfields was then forced to give 9% of say of the company to Invictus Gold, which was a BE company which was connected, very closely connected to the ANC and which was approved by the ANC's deployment committee. And I mean, the people on that BE, as part of that BE consortium, which was approved by the deployment committee, included at the time Baleka Mbete, who was then the chairwoman of the ANC. Then Mantu Sabalala, the late Mantu Sabalala Mtsimang, was the former health minister. And Jerome Browns, who represented Zuma at a time in his in the rape trial. So deployments have tentacles even in the private sector. Now, government contracts are the same. So I mean, I'll just give you the significance of government contracts. Now, in 2015 figures, so government has a procurement, a budget to buy goods and services, and this is, I'm using 2016 figures, of about 600 billion rand. So every year, 600 billion. It's with that 600 billion, that budget, it buys products, it buys services. And then the then Chief Procurement Officer, Kenneth Brown, he at the time, this 2016, said there's about 4,000 government tenders a day to provide services and goods to government. So these are 2016, so of course it's many more now. And he said, I mean, incredibly, at the time, Kenneth Brown, he said at least 40% of that 600 billion budget, and that's very conservatively now, 40% goes either to some kind of political connected contracts and is wasted corruptly and so on. So you're going to have to imagine a 600 billion procurement budget, 40%, and most will be more, is essentially goes away to really connected cadres in one way or the other. And when Kenneth Brown wanted to, I mean, when he was appointed and he wanted to change that whole system, I mean, he received death threats, he was under pressure to resign. I mean, eventually he quit because life was just made very difficult for him, and his life was in danger. Now let's look at deployment of cadres in local government. I mean, there was a judgment very recently in the Amatoli district municipality where the courts found that the ANC's deployment system actually really was part of the reason why that municipality has collapsed. And actually the court actually issues a statement essentially that, you know, it is illegal for the deployment committee to have such powers at a municipal level because it is responsible for the collapse of many municipalities. I mean, there's a couple of, if you look at, I recently completed a report which will come out next year, next month. The State of the Cities report that comes out. I mean, I did a 2016 one also. Again, I looked at the CADRE deployment, and these reports become public, it's government reports, public, and its impact on municipalities. So a number of the municipalities that are in distress, that have to be bailed out, really a big reason why they collapse, whether it's financial collapse or service delivery collapse, is because of, we can directly link cadre deployment. Either incompetent persons being deployed as a municipal manager or to the executive, or you know, procurement of services, public services goes to employees who don't deliver services, so the municipality collapse. Municipality hand out these contracts, but the companies do not deliver, and the municipality doesn't hold these companies accountable because the people are connected, they are approved by the deployment committee, and the municipality cannot deal with these sort of protected deployees. I mean, of course, you know, I mean, at a municipal level particularly, the deployment policy has been criticized, I must say, by other ANC members quite recently. I do remember, for example, in, when was it? When Nihami Babwe was the former chair of the Parliament's Defence Portfolio Committee. I mean, he called for the ANC to look at, to either abandon its deployment committee when it comes to the municipal level. And I'm going to quote him. So in 2010, what he said. I mean, he said essentially that deployment committee has been responsible for many of the incompetent municipal managers appointed to many municipalities, and it's also directly linked to the collapse of many municipalities and metros. Now, more recently, it's come under scrutiny that the deployment committee also had its reach in the appointment of judges to the judiciary. I mean, the Zondo Commission, of course, President Ramaphosa talked about it, but you know, in the past that has been denied. So you can imagine that's on, you know, on the bench. There are some people who've been deployed who's been there because they've been deployed, and so on. What does it mean? Because the judiciary so far has been, you know, the one democratic institution that really has been our saving grace in the face of state capture. In a state of, when a state is indifferent, one can go, ordinary citizens and communities can go to the court, can go to the judiciary, and the judiciary has really been the strength of our democracy in the face of state failure. Now you can imagine if deployment gets escalated in the judiciary, or more people gets appointed as judges, it most probably will lead to the collapse of this exemplary institution. We've of course also seen in our Chapter 9 institutions, our Constitution makes provision for Chapter 9 institutions to protect ordinary citizens, protect the public resources. But many of those entities have been populated by deployed cadres who listen to the ANC first rather than the Constitution, or rather than acting in the public interest. That's why we've seen many of these institutions, they're supposed to be protective, have become totally toothless. Now, I'm going to end off, and we can just open up for questions, just maybe with a quote from Prof. Gordon, if you all remember the day when then President Jacob Zuma fired former Finance Minister Nene and deployed then Des van Rooyen as the Finance Minister for a couple of days. So the cost of that deployment to the economy, I mean the immediate cost to the, because that gives you an idea of the cost to the wider economy of other kinds of deployment. I mean, I'm going to quote then Minister Pravin Gordhan. He said, on that single day, when Des van Rooyen was deployed as finance minister, the market value of the country's 17 biggest financial and property shares fell 219 billion rand. You just have to think about it. On that single day, market value of the country's 17 biggest financial and property shares fell 219 billion rand. So I'm using that quote to show to you. So it is the deployment of incompetent people do not only in fact just impact on the state itself, but also on the private sector. And again, on that day when when Van Rooyen was deployed as a finance minister, South African bonds lost 12% of their capital, something like 260 billion rand. The rand itself on that day plunged, depreciated against the US dollar overnight from 13 rand 14 cents to 15 rand 14 cents. Now, its impact on jobs on that day, 148,000 jobs in the private sector were lost on that day. 148,000 jobs were lost by that single event. Thank you very much. I'm open to questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Gumede. It's a bit of a depressing picture that you've painted, but I think we need that amount of detail, so thank you. So I want to play devil's advocate a little bit here. I think it's necessary. If we go back to 1994, the ANC comes into power with an overwhelming popular mandate. We'll never know exactly what percentage of the population voted for them in that first election, but we can take that it was well over 60%, maybe even 2/3. And they inherit a civil service which obviously had been orientated for many decades to the protection of a minority, the promotion of a minority, to the upholding of the apartheid ideology. What were they supposed to do? Because the ANC obviously would argue we needed to reorientate that civil service, in particular departments like police, the defense, home affairs, the developmental departments and things like that. What choice did they have? If it wasn't going to be CADRE deployment, what should they have done?
I think, again, of course, now we're looking with hindsight, looking back. I think the mistake that the ANC did was, if they, at that time, if there was, what they should have done is maybe a much more of deploying people with skills, not necessarily because you're a cadre of the ANC. That would have made a difference. So possibly one could argue the deployment may have worked possibly, if it had meant that the ANC would look around the country, look around the world, South Africans with a competency and the skills, who are not part of the inner circle of the ANC, and bring them back or get them and recruit them with sort of a talent, almost, headhunting process, getting the best people to turn around the state. In that context, deployment would have worked. But essentially what deployment has been doing, the way to operate it, yes, that was the stated aim was to transform the state. But in reality, what happened was that, the ANC leadership appointed loyal cadres, and it was used as a patronage system. Now, if it was used as a merit-based system, I think the public would also have supported it. So if deployment was merit-based, and merit-based, I mean not just merit-based within the ANC, but merit-based within the wider society, of bringing in people that the ANC may not have known, that is not within the ANC's inner circle, but have the competencies and skills, and bring them in. So that would have been a better deployment. And that is, of course, what has happened in South Korea in the 1960s, when they started building from scratch. Some of the now very competitive industries, whether it's biotech and so on. I mean, they actually was a different kind of deployment where they actually looked around the world for people who have some kind of connection to South Korea and brought them back and made them, offers they can't refuse, to either start something new or to lead a state-owned entity or start a new private company. Now that's a different kind of a deployment. And of course, maybe if that would have been the route, it would have been very much different. I don't think we would have seen the scale of state collapse that we've seen now.